Why am I not, and why will I never be a social justice warrior? Well, if you look at history, there's a constant thread to this social justice theme. For example, I'm sure you would agree that the communists were social justice warriors. They had a socialist political agenda which involved overthrowing established power or structure, violently so. And the reason for that, of course, was to correct perceived social injustice. The same can be said of the Nazis as well, and of course the same can be said of today's modern social justice warriors. And they share a number of themes in common. For example, the communists had a victim culture. Their perceived victims were the workers, the working class. They were the underclass, and in Adolf Hitler's Nazi narrative, the underclass were the Germans. They were being oppressed and exploited. And in contemporary social justice, it's minorities, of course. It's blacks, anyone who's not sort of straight, isn't cis, and also women, and so on and so forth. And that's, by the way, not to say that these people weren't oppressed. They certainly may have been, or were perhaps in some ways. So I'm not saying that's wrong. Also, they had secondly, there was a perpetrating class of people, and usually there's a fairly broad brushstroke in who the perpetrating class are. So for like the communists in Russia, it was the bourgeoisie, the wealthy, the aristocracy. They were the enemy, the class enemy. And for the Germans, of course, it was the Jews, and perhaps other groups, capitalists as well, in common with the Soviet communists. They hated capitalism. And of course, today's modern social justice warriors, the enemy is straight white males, and so on and so forth. So those two threads are in common. Thirdly, they tend to dehumanize the perpetrating class. So for the communists, they had propaganda, and they would depict capitalists, and they would be these sort of fat, porcine, greedy, money-grabbing people. So of course they're characterizations. They're not accurate. They're not about real people. They're not stories about how people actually make money. And not necessarily wrong in some ways. The aristocracy certainly used violence to achieve wealth. So there was a social injustice there. And for the Nazis, they're dehumanizing. They would talk about the Jews as being parasites, being lice upon the German people. And today, of course, there's all the hate of and shaming of men, and particularly white men, as sort of terrorists, as violent, misogynistic, hateful, etc., etc. So there's dehumanizing today. And what else? The tactics. They're political in nature. They're violent. Obviously, the communists were, in Russia and so forth, were bloody revolutionaries, killed a lot of people. Same with the Nazis, of course. They wanted to vanquish their enemies through violence. And today's social justice warriors, well, okay, perhaps they've tamed the rhetoric a little, and they're not calling for white men to be gassed, but there is still, that is kind of out there as well. Among the more fringe and extreme elements, there are those kind of things said. And then you have the likes of Antifa and some of the more extreme left, who are basically terrorists. But even the more moderate so-called social justice warriors are primarily, their objective is to influence legislation and to cause legislation to be passed. And of course, legislation is enforced with violence. So, okay, their terrorism is petty terrorism of the police state, but nevertheless, it's an oppression, and it's morally wrong. So, what's my position on this? Well, I believe in natural justice, as say described by Lysander Spooner. Also, it's libertarians tend to call it the non-aggression principle, and it's really quite simple in that you don't initiate actions that harm others without their consent. So obviously you can't make threats, you can't kidnap people, you can't hurt people, you can't commit fraud or anything else that harms people. You can't initiate those actions. And the reason why I'm in favour of this view of social justice, or as I would just call it, justice or natural justice, is that it is objective and it's a sort of a time-honoured system. It's the basis of the most ancient legal systems that were basically overthrown in time by the statist agenda. So it's rational, it's consistent, it's universal, and it can be derived logically. And we can say it's objective also in a practical sense, not perhaps perfectly objective like a science, but the fact is that rapists don't want to be raped, and the fact is that thieves don't want what they've taken to be stolen. So there's an objectivity. People that commit armed robberies don't want to be the victims of armed robberies. So there's a human constant there. So there's an objective or near objective sense of morality to framing justice in this way, and therefore that's something you can build a uniform sort of social order around, which you can't do with these ideas of social justice because they contain subjective opinion, and often faulty and flawed opinion. And social justice is also a reflection of, I think, emotional toxicity. There's this thing called, I think, the victim perpetrator rescuer triangle. So there's a sort of psychological role-playing thing going on in it. Social justice is often based on false theories that are basically just envy underneath them, and greed, of course, greed for power, and the desire to inflict violence upon perceived enemies instead of actually looking at yourself and seeing if your problems in life could be of your own cause. So that's my position, and I hope you enjoyed this program, and if you have any comments, please comment, and please do like and share. Thanks for listening.